Main priorities that the British government has in Somalia. So the first one is the development programme. The second is around the politics and building a stable and inclusive political system. And the third one is about security and improving the security in the country so that Somalis can live normal lives, including through building up the Somali National Army.
Right.
So on development, this is a really vast programme. The bilateral aid programme alone is over £100 million. And that's focused on a few key areas. So we're the lead on health, for example, the biggest donor in that area. And some of the things I'm most proud of is over 136,000 children immunised as a result of our programme, real improvements in maternal health and child mortality, and also feeding programmes which have reached over 1 million children. So some really impressive results in that area. Broader than that, we're also working on trying to build the economy of Somalia, provide jobs and livelihoods and an opportunity for people rather than just focusing on the emergency situations. So, for example, we've trained over 5,000 people in new livelihoods, including in agriculture. And we've also helped create over 250,000 jobs in Somalia through our aid programme, 70,000 of those being long-term opportunities.
Right. I understand also that you're interested in working and building a relationship with the Somali diaspora. Tell us a bit about that.
That's right. So in my preparation before I went to Somalia, I've travelled around the UK and I've met diaspora communities here in London, but also in Leicester and Bristol. And I think the Somali diaspora has played a really vital role in the rebuilding of Somalia, but also in UK politics and the UK government's attitude and approach towards Somalia. So the diaspora, for example, engaged really strongly on the cat ban. They've been engaged on finding solutions to the remittance problem, and I think they've helped keep the attention of the government on Somalia and make sure it stays a high priority. The other thing that really struck me is meeting people who are so engaged in community projects in Somalia. So a lot of people helping families, but also supporting small charities, whether it's for a disabled group or whether it's to try and build a school or to provide something back to Somalia. And I've been really impressed by that and want to help that.
daba horudhaca kadib ayaa waxaan wax ka weydiiyay waxyaalaha ahmiyadda gaarka marka ugu horeysa ay siinayso markay dalkii hooyo tagto waxa kamid ah.
So I think stability is the top word, if I had to do it in one word. If I had to do it in 3 sentences or 3 words, I would say stability, security and livelihoods.
Right. Those are your main priorities. Right. Speaking about security, we know security situation in Somalia is not the best. Al-Shabaab are very active. Last week, they managed to take over a base from some of the African Union and kill almost 70 soldiers or more. They attacked Somalia, as you know. And there is more than 22,000 African soldiers on the ground today as we speak. On top of that, you have the Somali National Army, as not as well trained as the African Union. And yet, they cannot keep Al-Shabaab out of the main cities.
So it's a really difficult situation, and we've seen the tragic attacks last week in Lego, but also other areas of Somalia as well. I think when you're dealing with Somalia, there are a lot of problems day to day, and clearly a lot of security problems. But what I found useful was taking a long view back. So if you look back 3 years or 5 years or 10 years and compare the security situation, there have been massive strides. Although 22,000 AMISOM, the same again in terms of Somali forces, seems like a lot. It's a big country and Al-Shabaab is a big threat. So AMISOM and the SNA have helped drive Al-Shabaab out of a lot of their strongholds, but it's very clear that there's a long way to go and that Al-Shabaab still maintains this capability to attack, including in Mogadishu as well. What we're trying to do as the British government is to focus very hard on building up the capability of the Somali National Army, make sure they get the training they need. We're providing direct support on stipends to ensure that they're paid as well, and making sure we're working with international donors and with the Somali government to help them really take the fight to Al-Shabaab. But it's a difficult and slow process.
waxaan kaloo wax ka weydiiyey sidii looga hortagi lahaa qaraxyada al-shabaab dalka gudihiisa ay ka geystaan oo in badan soo noqnoqdo dowladda iyo ciidamada qalaad ee dhulka joogaana aysan marnaba mas-uuliyaddeeda aysan qaadanin haddana dad fara badan ay naftooda ku waayaan ciidanka Soomaaliyeedna uu yahay mid tabar yar iyo waxa ay ka qabanayaan sidii arrimahaas loo soo afjari lahaa dalka Soomaaliyeedna ciidan xoog badan loogu dhisi lahaa waxayna ku jawaabtay sida tan.
So first let me pick up on your point about the people who are most affected, and you're absolutely right. The people who are most damaged and most affected by Al-Shabaab attacks are the Somali people themselves. Politicians as well and MPs, but actually it's normal people trying to live out their lives. In terms of attacks, I think it's really important that where there have been mistakes or errors, that there's a continual learning process to make sure lessons are learned and that the same mistakes aren't happening again. And I know that the AU and AMISOM are looking at the moment to see how they can best support their troops and make sure they can operate in those sorts of environments effectively.
waxaan kaloo wax ka weydiiyey dagaalka military ee lagula jiro ururka al-shabaab intuu socon doono iyo sidii xal loogu heli lahaa in la wada fariisto oo mar qura fooda la isdaro oo table-ka inta la soo wada fariisto marka ayagana la weydiiyo waxa ay qabaan ama xalka uu ku jiro dowladuna marka arrinta ay ka shaqeyso iyo international community-na ay gacan ku siiyaan sida dagaalka loo soo afmeeri lahaa waxayna ku jawaabtay sida tan soo socota.
Yes, I do. I think it's really important to have the military aspect, but it's just as important to make sure that you are having proper strategies to counter extremism. And that includes having a system of reconciliation and reintegration so that you can disarm people who want to come in and give them alternative livelihoods, and we're working on that. I think it's really important to make sure people realise that Al-Shabaab does not speak for Islam, and that there is a peaceful alternative and a peaceful approach. And I think when I look at some of the strategies, it's always a matter of dialogue and engagement for those who want to come in and making sure you have the means to combat the people who refuse to reconcile and to join.
Right. Often we hear the 2016 vision, the election is taking place. The President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed himself said that there will be no extension. It will definitely take place. What form would it take place?
I think what is important is that whatever process takes place in 2016 is one that is more inclusive and that builds on the last process in 2012. So something that is more consultative, that's transparent, and that keeps up a positive trajectory for the country.
There's people who are fed up with the political infight between the President and the Prime Ministers, and this delay the political process. For example, the constitution is not complete. There is no proper political opposition parties who can participate in the elections. How much does the political infight affect the Vision 2016?
Well, I think it is really frustrating when infighting stops progress. So one of the messages that I think is really important for us all to give is that leaders, politicians, people in positions of authority really have to put the country first. And that's going to be increasingly important in the next year to 18 months. In terms of specific fights, I'm not following it, but I think what we are in a position now, having had the delays, is that we really need to focus on the top priorities for the next year, on the political settlement and keeping stability.
Right. Also, one of the other things that often come up when the political infight breaks up and the President and the Prime Ministers are fighting is that the confidence of Somali people are undermined there's no proper political visionaries in the country, as some say often. Do you think, like you said, the country should be put first and the political fight should be put away, and make sure that we focus on what is important to rebuild Somalia, and the government should be held responsible?
So definitely the most important thing is to rebuild Somalia. I think what we have to remember is we're very early on in the process, and a lot of the institutions are interim institutions. So there have been some real successes, and I would talk about the federal map and the progress that that's made, and the fact that you've been able to have dialogue rather than fighting in many of the cases to try and resolve some of those disputes and boundaries. So I think there are really good things that we can take from the last year or two, and we've got to remember the progress rather than only focusing on the problems. But having said that, clearly there's a big mountain ahead, and it's going to be hard work to get there, and that will need, proper engagement, proper accountability by all.
The corruption in Somalia is such a huge problem, and Britain is giving millions of pounds to the Somali government, different various programs that you mentioned, led by different, most of them I believe. How can you ensure that funding is not being misused, it doesn't go missing?
So that's a really good question, and I think there are two parts to the answer. So I think there's one part which is about how do we make sure taxpayers' money is not diverted. And for that, DFID have some really clear monitoring arrangements, and they track what they're spending and what the effect is. But perhaps more importantly, in the wider context, is about what are we doing to try and tackle corruption in Somalia and also make sure people receive the full benefits. So we've been involved in this quite a lot, and Prime Minister Cameron has said that one of his priorities is to tackle the cancer of global corruption. In Somalia, we've got a few specific things. So one is that we're trying to increase the information and the transparency of what we're doing and what the government is doing by putting out the information on what we're spending so people can see whether it happens or not. The second is we're involved in training local officials and federal officials to make sure they know how to follow good procedures and get value for money. And then I think the role of the Financial Governance Committee is going to be even more important in the coming year or two. So it's great that they've had additional resources, but there are some big contracts coming up, and the more that that committee can be empowered and make sure it has oversight of the really big deals to ensure that there isn't corruption, that there's value for money and the benefit goes to the Somali people, the better. And that's certainly a strong message that I have.
President Hassan Mohamud often say the international community promised they will give millions of aid to Somalia, but that money does not reach Somalia, he says. A tiny bit comes. What is the British government doing to make sure that all that money is collected and spent in the right way in Somalia?
So I can understand the frustrations of people saying, we don't see the direct impact of what you're spending on the ground.
Is the president actually saying that the money did not reach the Somali government?
So I think there's a difference between whether it reaches the Somali government or the Somali people.
Right.
So under the New Deal, the Somali government and the regions are deciding on what their priorities are and what they want to have done. And we're working with them to make sure our spend reflects Somali priorities.
Right.
And I think that's really important. However, we don't put all of our money through the Somali government systems. Sometimes it's more efficient, easier to go direct and pay for a contractor. I think the important thing is the effect is the one that the Somalis want. And if I can give you a couple of examples of real impact on the ground that have struck me. So in Kismayo there's a really good project which is looking at sport and reconciliation. So there's been a refurbishment of the stadium, the football stadium, giving equipment to children and young people and trying to bring them together to take them out of crime. In Galkayo we've had solar street lighting, which means markets can operate into the evening, and prosperity has grown. In Burao, we've been funding a midwifery clinic, which has really improved the well-being of mothers-to-be and children. So there's some really practical things on the ground where you can see an effect. Building roads, building canals, giving jobs. But the other thing is a lot of our money is going into capacity and long-term development and building up institutions. And perhaps that's less visible because you don't get a building which everyone can point to and say that's what the British have done.
But those who say the reason why you use the contractors and third party is because you don't trust the Somali government. It comes down to transparency and corruption again.
So I think there are lots of things that we do because they are just quicker and easier, and if you're trying to get an effect, that's what you need to do. But equally, we do know that there still needs to be a lot more capacity in the Somali system. There is corruption, and so if we're giving value to the taxpayer and making sure the money reaches, ordinary Somalis, then we'll take the best means there. I think the IMF was really interesting on this. So when they came in to look at debt relief, what they've said is there is a lot that the government needs to do in financial management before it can really start on the process. And it's given some of those indicators of exactly what the government needs to do. So there's a long process ahead. It's normal in these circumstances to also use contractors and other delivery agents.
Right. When it comes to the unity of Somalia, where does the British government stand?
So for the UK, I think there'll always be a soft spot for Somaliland. We have a common history and many people here have spent time there and engaged with Somaliland. In terms of independence, I think our position is pretty well established, and it's really for the Somali people to determine what happens. We think it's really important to have a constructive dialogue and increase cooperation, and I was really pleased to see the President's statement that he was opening up talks with Hargeisa. So I think that's a really positive development and something that we would be supporting.
But those talks in Dubai, it took place in Turkey, and took place in Djibouti, often ends up with no fruits at all. So the talks is one thing, but when it comes to the British government, because the argument Somaliland is put forward is that they have peace and stability for 23 years. 4 different elections took place, democratic elections, especially the last 2. Why wouldn't you recognize them if that is their wish, since you have soft support for them?
So the first thing to stress is that Somaliland has achieved a huge amount, and you've mentioned some of those things, and I think it is an impressive achievement in the circumstances. But it's not just down to the UK to pronounce one way or the other. I think there are lots of areas still that need to be worked on. There are still areas of dispute there, and there are a lot of areas of cooperation that would need to be worked out if independence was on the cards. So the most important thing is not what location talks are in, but I think having a process that makes progress, that builds trust, and that can lead to really active areas of cooperation.
If Somaliland is willing to be independent, there is the people who also live in that region who do not want to be independent. And at the moment they don't seem to have a voice. They want to be a united Somalia as we know it. Those people, they often accuse the Somaliland government for being oppressive, for not giving them opportunity to express themselves. Would you engage a dialogue with the authority in Somaliland to make sure those people are not oppressed, in particular people of Khartoum?
So I think this is exactly the thing that I was talking about, that it's easy to talk about Somaliland being independent now, but there are a lot of issues still, including Khartoum State, which have to be worked out and resolved as well, including with the federal government.
Right. Once again, let me put it in a different way. If I know the last parliament here was not keen to recognize Somaliland. I interviewed William Hague. He says we're not going to recognize Somaliland. and Mark Seaman, who was the African Foreign Minister at the time. What is the situation now in this new parliament? David Cameron is re-elected. What is the British point of view of Somalia being united once again? In other words, the North and the South being at one. Would you support that?
So I think our position is, as I said, which is that we're not going to say that it has to be united, but neither are we going to advocate for independence. This is something that needs to be worked out properly. Right now, we're not at that moment of declaration of independence, but what the government is clear on is that we want to support that dialogue and that cooperation. Right.
The other things I would like to ask you is the neighbouring countries and involvement in Somalia. I know many meetings that you went with Somalis. The issue of Ethiopia and Kenya come up time and again. Ethiopian soldiers are responsible, as people say, we cannot verify, a crime against humanity in various different places in Somalia. Yet, they have your support, Western support, international community support them to be there and giving them a blind check to carry on what they do or being accused. So my question to you is, what do you be able to, when you get Somalia, speak to the Ethiopian and the AMISOM forces to make sure that they don't abuse the very same people they're supposed to protect?
So you've raised a really important point, and it is something that a lot of the diaspora community have raised as well. And I think it's a difficult one, because when you have neighbours inside your country, it can be incredibly delicate. So yes, the British government is absolutely clear that abuses of civilians by AMISOM, by other troops, is not acceptable. And we're playing an active role in training AMISOM troops pre-deployment in human rights and in trying to prevent, for example, sexual abuses against women. Having said that, I do want to say that overall AMISOM has played a critical role in trying to bring stability to Somalia and in tackling Al-Shabaab. And as we saw from the incident in Lego, it's a very unsafe place and very dangerous for the soldiers there. So we have to make sure that their presence is a constructive one and that it doesn't contribute to any instability or any abuses. But I think it is important that we recognise what they have achieved as well. And obviously there's always room for improvement, and I'll be talking about that too.
Right. What is your message to the Somali community?
So my message to the Somali community is the British government is absolutely committed to the future of Somalia. We're here to help, and that's what my mandate is.
Harry, Matthew, thank you very much for being with us.
Real pleasure.